Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate your patience, and I'm all that stands between all of us and dinner, so I will keep that in mind as I proceed. So a couple of years ago, I was doing some research for the book that my brother and I have just completed when I stumbled on what I will call the Jake Powell incident. It's something that probably many of you who are much better read in the history of baseball were well aware of. I was not. And so I was quite fascinated by this and wanted to dig deeper. And so I'm going to tell that story to you this afternoon. It all happens late July of 1938. A live radio interview, WGN Chicago. Broadcaster steps into a dugout. Jake Powell, outfielder of the Yankees, starts talking and utters a racial slur. It's a sad story, partly because of the ugliness of the slur, but in many respects, it's also a sad story because there was an opportunity here for MLB to start reckoning with racism within its ranks, and they committed an error. Major League Baseball, instead of taking responsibility, circled the wagons, and we'll walk through and see very stark evidence of that. It's an illustration of how far white Major League Baseball officials and white sports writers were willing to go to dodge, downplay, and distract from reality. So let's take a look here. From the very beginning, Jake Powell was a troubled and pretty defiant baseball player. Long before he got to the major leagues, he had a habit of leaving hotel rooms with more than his luggage. And he had managers and owners who had to stop by the police station and bail him out occasionally. Happened in Dayton, happened in Baltimore. So this was a pretty troubled soul to begin with. And then there was this ugliness as well. So I'm a Detroit Tiger fan, so this really strikes close to home, right? 1935, the Tigers win the American League pennant. They make it to the World Series. In the end, that whole season goes, right? Okay, next year, everybody's thinking, hey, we can make it again. We can make it again. Well, fairly early in the season, Hank Greenberg is sidelined. And he's sidelined because of a wrist injury. And he thinks it might get better. It doesn't get better. He basically is out the rest of the season. It happens because of a collision that he has with Jake Powell. Hank Greenberg was not much of a complainer. At that time, you don't see a lot of news stories where he's weighing in and speculating on why that collision happened. But years later in his autobiography, Greenberg says that he hated playing Washington, and one of the reasons was they had players like Jake Powell who would pull dirty stunts. So he said that Jake Powell ran out of the proper baseline and hit him with his elbow, and that struck his wrist. There was another incident a few months after that in Chicago. This is at a time when Powell was playing with Washington. He was playing with the Washington Nationals. This was kind of his hometown team. He grew up not that far from me. He grew up in the northern suburbs of Washington, D.C. I live right across the river in Virginia. But he grew up in Silver Spring, and so he was, kind of a local boy. He's playing for Washington at that time when this happens. Chicago Tribune, a sports writer, tags him pretty early, calls him the high spike artist of the Senators. So there are a lot of ironies to this story, and this is one of them. Is that he has a connection with a man named Ben Chapman. Many of you know who Ben Chapman is, but those of you who don't, we're going to touch on that a little bit later. So a few days after that incident with the White Sox, the Yankees say, we've just made a deal. We have traded with Washington one-on-one. We're getting Ben Chapman, and the Yankees are giving up. The Yankees are giving up Ben Chapman. And I screwed that up again. Washington's giving up Jake Powell. They're getting Ben Chapman from the Yankees. Okay, sorted that out. The article here describes Chapman as a high-strung type of player. Indeed, he was. We'll get to that later. So there's an opportunity here for Powell to kind of turn over a new leaf and show that he can be a productive ball player and also behave himself. He has a really blowout World Series in 1936. He's in many respects considered the hero of that series for the Yankees. Bats .455. Notice the headline. It was a great kind of story for the sports writer. Hey, here's this guy who thought he might quit baseball and become a cop, and instead he plays on. He has this great World Series for the Yankees and helps lead New York to victory. This cop thing comes up as well, and this will circle back. So things seem to be going pretty well for him. 1937, his numbers aren't great, but he's still in mostly a platoon role. He's not an everyday player. He's a right-handed hitter. He's generally played by Joe McCarthy, mostly when they've got left-handers on the mound. This is the infamous afternoon, Comiskey Park. Bob Elson of WGN steps into the dugout and interviews Powell. He asks him a very simple question, and this is what ensued. Blackjack, of course, many of you can guess, but that means a policeman's nightstick. So this was the ugly comment that was made by Powell. Instantly, Elson cuts off the interview, lets his people, we're shutting down, we're not continuing this interview. He apologizes to people on the live feed. The next day, local Chicagoans, mostly black, but some white, show up at the ballpark. They're furious, and they want to make their voices known. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that Major League Baseball takes disciplinary action against a ball player for a racist deed or word. So there is a penalty that Powell takes on. However, the resulting furor and the debate is really is very dissatisfying, right? On the one hand, black journalists appropriately call MLB to task. The Chicago Defender weighs in. The New York Age also attacks the fact that Jake Powell initially says, well, I didn't say what they said I said. I didn't use that word. Then later on, he says, well, I did use that word, and you'll see how his stories kind of change and morph. The Pittsburgh Courier at least applauded the fact that MLB did take some action and the idea that that would send some sort of message. But the way that Yankee officials, MLB, and white sports writers reacted really was appalling. So, Powell at one point stops denying and says, well, my words weren't meant the way they sounded or the way I said them, or, he keeps trying to spin this. Landis kind of gives him cover as well, even though he mets out this disciplinary action by saying, well, I think this statement was due more to carelessness than intent. And the Yankee officials, very much followed that same line. I love this one, right? So Jacob Rupert says, I discussed this with my black servants and they agreed that this was just kind of an accidental slip of the tongue. I'm sure your servants felt very free to tell you what they were really thinking, Mr. Rupert. Ed Barrow, the business manager of the Yankees, said it just popped out. Wasn't intended as an insult. It's one of those things. And then McCarthy refers to it as a wisecrack. He was just probably trying to throw out a wisecrack. And white media, the Sporting News, I think, as all of us know, not exactly a great example in this era. There were a lot of disappointing articles and editorials from the Sporting News about a range of issues related to the color barrier. But they, again, downplayed it as well, right? Powell should have been more careful, but gosh, he's a hustling player and he's aggressive and he just kind of gets into jams, right? So a lot of whitewashing, pardon the pun, but I think it fits in this case. And then this was the other piece that really got me, was how the nature of the interview was used as a way also to distract, right? So a lot of white sports writers were like, well, these dugout interviews, they're a real problem. It catches people off guard. An Iowa sports writer said Bob Elson, who was the WGN broadcaster. Many of you know Elson broadcasted Cubs and White Sox games at home for many years. Bob Elson made a mountain out of a molehill. He asked him a simple question, and Powell responded with a racial slur. But this sports writer wanted us to believe that, this guy's doing him a favor, and Elson lets the Lions come at him. An Ohio sports writer: it's too bad Jake spoke out of turn when they shoved a Chicago mic under his nose. But he's a happy-go-lucky sort of guy. And then I also kind of appreciated this one. This was pretty annoying as well. This incident should make everybody, all public persons, wary of remarks they might give over the radio, which do not carry a prepared script. Because if you don't have a script, you're liable to just immediately use the N-word. I mean, this is kind of where he was coming from. So this is what the columnists are saying in most respects. There were some exceptions. Joe McCarthy also kind of circled back and piled on, these radio interviews, the radio stations come in and they distract people and they're bothering people and so forth. Let me just put this in context for those who don't know this. So, fact, Bob Elson had been doing dugout interviews for years, several years by the time he did this one in Chicago. So this wasn't some new exotic way to interview players. Number two, Bob Elson was not a sort of gotcha, sneaky kind of guy, right? The guy years later would win the Ford C. Frick Award from the Hall of Fame. He was recognized as an outstanding broadcaster. Judge Landis had lunch with him quite frequently and respected him as a broadcaster. In fact, he asked him to do the radio broadcast for the first All-Star game in 1933. So this is not some kind of smarmy, broadcaster. I mean, Bob Elson was a person of real standing here. So these comments are really pretty ridiculous. There were some exceptions among white sports writers that we should recognize and that I think are heartening. There was a New Jersey columnist for The Call. It's a northern New Jersey paper. They really took Powell to task. And this was an excerpt from what they published about the whole situation. And they also made the point to steer toward the color barrier, right? Some black players would not only fit into the major leagues, but would undoubtedly shine there. So giving some kind of pointing the way toward the issue of the color barrier. Westbrook Pegler had kind of a conservative political reputation, and yet this is what he had to say about it. I just thought this was a pretty powerful statement. Keep in mind, this was 1938, so I think there were a whole lot of Americans who had no idea exactly what Adolf Hitler had in mind for Jews, so I don't want to downplay that either. But I mean, this was where Pegler was coming from. Jake Powell, he said, was only giving expression in crude, brief wordage to the unspoken but inflexible segregation policy of the organized baseball industry. So Jake Powell from here starts to really unravel. It's in a way sad, but fitting in another respect. He was out for 10 days. The Yankees go on a road trip. They're playing Washington. Hey, this is his former team, right? Well, he goes into the outfield, and Griffith Stadium was segregated seating, and he's playing in front of a big section of black fans, and they let him know what they thought of what he had done. And so he get a shower of debris, soda, and pop bottles go at him. Joe McCarthy is furious and insists, hey, I'm going to keep playing him no matter what. Well, not really. Powell only started one game out of the next 28. He saw action in a couple of the others, once as a pinch runner, I believe, and I think he entered the game maybe fifth or sixth inning in one of the other games. But basically, his starting opportunities quickly curtailed. And despite McCarthy's rhetoric, he was not going to be playing them much. The Yankees surprised sports writers by deciding to resign Powell. There's some discussion of, all right, who's going to buy the rights for this guy? That may have been part of their situation, which was, we don't think we're going to get anything, any amount of money or compensation for him. In any case, he stays with the Yankees. He only appears in 31 games. His average drops a little bit, not dramatically, but a little. 1940 in spring training, he slams into a fence trying to catch a ball, and he suffers a skull fracture. So he doesn't even get to New York by mid-May. The rest of the season is not terribly productive. He ends up getting demoted to the minor leagues, plays in multiple cities out on the West Coast, Mid-Atlantic. He eventually makes his way to Washington again. And he plays there for portions of 3 seasons. Then in 1945, Washington trades him to the Phillies, whose manager happens to be Ben Chapman, the manager who became quite known as the one delivering the most vicious, racist heckling of any manager in the National League during the rookie season of Jackie Robinson. There is a photograph here in the hall of Chapman pictured with Jackie Robinson. It's a photo that basically officials wanted to stage because they nudged Chapman to apologize. Well, let's take a nice picture. And Jackie Robinson years later said, that was the most difficult photograph I was ever asked to take because I had to kind of smile as if everything was fine now, right? Anyway, Powell's career is really over. He really just flounders in Philly. Obviously not a terrific time in Philadelphia for the Phillies. They struggled that whole era. But his baseball career, for all intents and purposes, is over. And then the irony of this guy who said he always wanted to be a cop, his whole story about carrying a nightstick, in fact, itself was a lie. He was never a cop in Dayton. It was something he thought about doing, but he never became a cop. And his life ends up ending in a police station. He was passing bad checks. He was picked up on a warrant in D.C. The state of Florida had put under a warrant for passing bad checks there. He's with his girlfriend. He's dragged into the police office. He has a gun on him, much to the surprise of the policeman. He is in the vestibule area, pulls the weapon and shoots and kills himself. So this was the end to Jake Powell, both life and career. So, the question I think that's worth pondering is, was there any silver lining to this? Steve Wolf of ESPN contends there is, that out of this may have come some of the initial push and discussion. And I showed you one of the columnists who really raised the issue of why aren't blacks playing in MLB? But my search of the media, the coverage, shows very little of that, actually. I'm not so sure that it'd be very easy for us to say, hey, there's a silver lining. I think it's tough to see from my vantage point. I think it really is a sad story because it demonstrates that there was an opportunity that MLB fumbled to really be honest and to start reckoning with the whole situation. By the same token, there were some people who said, wait a minute, when are we going to deal with this? So it's tough to say, but this is an interesting chapter for us to remember. Any Yankees player, whatever they do something on the field or off the field, the nature of the Yankees as a ball club, right? It's quite likely to make news. So I was kind of surprised I didn't hear about this. It was an interesting story, I thought, and very much a reflection of the gentleman's agreement era where black players were shut out of baseball. In any case, this is the book that we've been working on. It's coming out in October, and I appreciate your time. Oh, yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Any questions for Mark?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I did not know this, but at the end of that article, he killed himself. It said he shot himself twice. Any idea that's possible?
Yeah, I had the same reaction. I find it hard to believe the second shot got fired, but who knows? Maybe he managed to screw up the first shot in the same way he screwed up his life in many other ways. It's really quite unfortunate, but I noticed that too. I'm like, really, a second shot? Yes, sir.
So I don't know if you came across a great presentation, by the way. I really enjoyed it. I don't know if you came across, Matt, that apparently Powell was sent off on what today we would call an apology tour.
Yes.
So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So proof that PR is not a past 50 years kind of invention. It was very much in evidence there. So the Yankees clearly, Barrow and the other team leaders, you basically send him up to Harlem. They find some black entertainer who likes the Yankees and say, hey, can you please take Powell to restaurants and clubs and taverns and, tell him he's not such a terrible guy. And the New York Age wrote a separate column about that, about how absurd it was that he went in. And clearly he didn't even think this through. So he begins by telling the people that he didn't really say what everybody in the world says that he said. So that didn't go over too well. And then, well, if I said it, I didn't, So he stammered and stumbled his way through that. But yeah, there was this whole weekend where they said, okay, we're going to send you up to Harlem and tell all the black people there that you really didn't do it, or you're sorry, or you're this, or you're that. And it was not handled all that well.
As far as the business with Chapman, who around the time he was with the Yankees, I believe might have had some racial comments and behavior here and there. The incident in Philly before that picture, the baiting of Robinson was in Ebbets Field in Brooklyn. It didn't become known right away, but by the time the Dodgers traveled to Philadelphia, it was well known what had happened in Brooklyn, and Walter Winchell had featured it, the baiting of Robinson, on his evening broadcast on the weekend. So it was a major, major problem when Robinson came in to Philadelphia. So the picture appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer the day of the first game between the Dodgers and the Phillies in Philadelphia.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. Yeah, it's an interesting kind of backstory. Yes.
I'm assuming the answer is no, but are there any players on record, either in real time or maybe in retrospect, writing about the incident, the Yankee players?
I have not read enough. I think there are three categories in life. Really, you either love the Yankees, you hate the Yankees, or you're ambivalent. There are maybe 7 people in that ambivalent category. I'm a Tigers fan, so I think you know what category I'm in. I don't spend a lot of time reading Yankee player biographies and autobiographies, so I am not really in a good position to know whether there was that. There may be people, I'm sure there are people here who might have read enough to know whether they've picked up anything about that incident. So yeah, it's a good question though, when that came up. Yes.
Just a quick comment. It seems to be a wonderfully interesting, it really speaks to 1938 and what the year 1938 before the war, and the real press for integration. The game was segregated, free speech. There's so many issues there, but I think you were smart to focus on kind of the personal pathos of Jake Powell's life. Appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, he was kind of a train wreck from probably the point he entered baseball, as I point out. If he wasn't stealing something, he was going in with spikes high to injure them. Anybody else? Okay, well, listen, thanks again. I appreciate the opportunity.